Into our notes. So if I said, take a number, subtract 2, multiply by -4, how would you find the inverse? Okay. Okay, so we would say take a number. If we were working backwards, we would still have to start with a number, and then what would we do? Divide by -4 and add 2. Okay, so we just do the opposite. Okay, so if I had y equals negative times x plus 3 squared minus 7, to find an inverse, what is the very first thing we do? Very first thing. Look at your notes. Yeah. Nope. Before you even start to do inverse operations, the very first thing you do. No? Switch the x and the y. So we're going to say x equals negative of y plus 3 squared minus 7. So the very first thing we do is trade the x and y. And then when we undo the operations, we do PEMDAS backwards. Order of operations you do backwards when you're trying to solve something. So you would add or subtract something to the other side. So what could we add or subtract over? Okay, so we're going to add 7 to the other side. So I'm going to put, we're going to add or subtract, that's the next step. So we end up getting x plus 7 equals negative y plus 3 squared. Okay. So PEMDAS, we just did the add or subtract step. What comes before that? Multiply or divide. Is there something we could multiply or divide to the other side? Yeah, the -1 right here. Do you guys want to multiply by -1 on each side, or do you want to divide by -1 on each side? Divide? Okay, so divide by -1, divide by -1. Okay, so x plus 7, if we divide those by -1, what's x divided by -1? What is 7 divided by -1? -7. Okay, what's the next step in PEMDAS? Exponents. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of exponents. So how do we get rid of the exponent in the problem? And square root. So the squared and the square root cancel, and we are left with y plus 3. And on the left side, we have negative x minus 7 underneath the square root. Okay. And then what's the very last step of PEMDAS going to be for us? Yeah, and that's the P part, right? Parentheses. So now we're doing the last step, which was the part that was inside the parentheses. Okay, so I'm going to put P. This is the part inside the parentheses. So now we minus 3 minus 3. So we have the square root of negative x minus 7. The minus 3 happened after the square root sign, and so it has to go outside. You can't say negative 7 minus 3. It has to go outside because it happened afterwards. We're going to say that equals y. And then we have to fix the notation to show that this is an inverse. Do you guys remember how we fixed the notation? Yeah, y negative 1. So the original problem said y equals, and so our inverse should say y inverse so that it can match the notation. So if the notation said f of x, then ours would say f inverse of x. If the notation said g of x, ours would say g inverse of x. If it says y, then we say y inverse. So we always make sure that our notation matches the notation of the original problem. Okay, well, let's try another one. How did you feel about that, though? Did that seem reasonable? Did it kind of make sense? Did it feel like it had common sense to it, or did you feel like you were just making up steps? So the PEMDAS backwards is the big thing. So trading X and Y and then doing PEMDAS backwards. That'll tell you exactly how to do every single problem, okay? All right, let's do another one. Okay. F of x equals 1/2 times the third root of x minus 5 plus 7. Give it a second. I think it's going to make the colors look better, maybe. Okay. All right, so first step is to what? Trade the x and the y. Okay, so first step, and this right here, f of x, is another way of saying y. That's another way of saying y. Oh, look at that. I drew over it, but it didn't even do anything. All right, so trade the x and the y. Okay. And then what do I do? Subtract 7. So we do PEMDAS backwards, and so the very last thing that happens in PEMDAS is add or subtract. So for us, that's the very first thing we're going to do. And we're going to minus 7 minus 7. So I have x minus 7 equals 1/2 times the third root of y minus 5. Okay. So we did add subtract. What's our next step? Multiply or divide. So how can you get rid of a 1/2? Yeah, so you could divide by 1/2, but a lot of students are not very comfortable dividing by fractions. The other way you could get rid of it is by multiplying it by 2. So do you guys want to divide by 1/2 or do you want to multiply by 2? Multiply. So I'm going to say times 2, and then over here I'll say times 2. So these cancel, and I get cube root of y minus 5. And then with the 2 and the x minus 7, you can distribute the 2, or you can leave it with the parentheses. Do you guys want to distribute the 2, or do you want to leave it? Distribute? Okay. 2x minus 14. Okay. Then what do we do? Yeah, so the next part is exponents. So here we're not getting rid of an exponent really. We're using an exponent to get rid of a root. So we're going to do this to the exponent of 3 because that's going to get rid of a cube root. And that means we're going to do this to the exponent of 3 as well. So the cube root and the exponent of 3 cancel out. And so last, we're getting at the part that was inside the parentheses. And the y minus 5 is kind of like what was inside. There weren't parentheses there, but it was inside a radical. So we're getting at the inside part last. And now we're going to go ahead and add 5. And I have to compare this notation with the original problem. So the original problem said f of x. Our notation says y. So how should we change this to make it match the original problem? So we're going to say f inverse of x. Instead of writing y, we're going to say f inverse of x because we're making the notation match. Okay. Do you guys want to do another one? You're okay? We're okay? Okay, we're going to do one more. I saw a few head shakes, and then we will practice on the assignment. All right, so last example. G of x equals negative 3/5 x plus 11. Okay, so what am I going to do with that g of x? Say it again? Yeah, so I'm going to say that this is actually the y value. And then what do I do with the y and the x? Trade them. So x equals negative 3/5y plus 11. So I'm going to say trade x and y. Now, some people are going to have a hard time with this fraction. And so there's one way you can rewrite that part to make it easier to deal with. You can say that it's kind of like the y's over 1. And you can say that's like having negative 3y over 5. You guys see what I did there? All I did is I rewrote it so that it would be easier for me to tell how to undo the problem. That's all I did. Okay, so I didn't do very much math. I didn't start doing PEMDAS backwards yet. I just rewrote that so it would be easier to deal with when I got to it. Right, Zoe? All right, so what do I do now? Yeah, so I'm going to add or subtract. That's the last step of PEMDAS. I'm going to add or subtract to get stuff to the other side. So I'm going to minus 11 minus 11. So I have x minus 11 equals negative 3y over 5. And now what am I going to do? Yeah, we're going to say our next step is to multiply or divide. And when we do the multiply or divide step, you guys can actually see maybe that we have a divide by 5 happening, but we also have a multiply by negative 3 happening. So it's going to take us 2 steps to finish this part. Okay, so what do you want to get rid of first, the negative 3 or the 5? The 5, so what do we do? Okay, so I'm going to say times 5 times 5. Okay, do you guys want to leave the 5 out there with the parentheses, or do you want to multiply it inside? Multiply it inside? Okay, so we end up getting 5x minus 55, okay? And then what are we going to do next? Yeah, so next we're still on that same step of multiply or divide because we didn't finish it. We didn't finish that step, so now we're going to go through and divide by negative 3. All right, now most math people would not leave a negative on the bottom. It's not that it's wrong, It's just that most math people don't like to do that. So they would leave the 3 down there, but probably not the negative. So if you have a positive 5x and you're dividing it by a negative, what happens to the 5x? It would turn negative. If you have a negative 55 divided by a negative, what would happen? It would turn positive, and then you still have the 3 on the bottom. You could leave your answer like this and it would not be wrong, but if you were doing a multiple choice problem, this answer would probably not be there. This answer would. Does that make sense? Because math people are the ones who would come up with answers for multiple choice problems. Okay, so it's always good to know that if you got either of these, you're right both times, but you might not see this on an answer key, you might only see that one. Okay, is this the right notation to end our problem on? No, how should we fix it? Yeah, so we're going to say G inverse of X. We're going to change the notation at the end to make it match the beginning. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and practice. I made you guys another color by number sheet. And this one is Notorious B.I.G. So he looks pretty fly. Do you like it? Do you like it? I'm pretty sure I have a Tupac one, actually. We gotta get Tupac in there. Eminem is in there too. He's the only white guy in there, but he's there. So. All right. What do I do first on number 5? Switch the X and the Y. Then you're going to add 7. Yeah, divide by -1, or you could multiply by -1. Either way is fine. Okay. So divide by -1, divide by -1. And what does that give you? -x minus 7 equals the square root of y plus 4. Square both sides. So we have -x minus 7 squared equals y plus 4. And then we minus 4. Do you minus the 4 from the 7? No, because that's inside of something. You have to just write it on the end. So now we're going to say y equals -x minus 7 squared with a minus 4 on the end. Okay. Choose a color for that problem. Green. You guys can write a different color if you want. Green. All right, then we're going to flip it over. We're going to look for that answer on the back. It's J. What's different about this problem and the answer we just got? Yeah, this time they didn't put the negative with the numbers. They left it in the front. Do you guys see that? So it still has the squared, it still has the minus 4, but it doesn't have the -x minus 7 because they left the negative out. Okay, so when you do this worksheet, every so often you're going to run into a problem like that where your answer is a little bit different than the answer key, even though you both have the same thing. Does that make sense? Okay, now the answer key over here is saying that next to the answer choice, you need to put the correct notation. So if the original problem said y equals, then what notation do you need to put next to J? Y inverse. So you're the one who has to fill in that blank with the correct notation. So you put y inverse, and then we know the answer to number 5 is J. Okay? Does that make sense? So we have an extra little step on there. So if you're having a hard time finding your answer, you might double check and see that they could have left a number outside of the parentheses, okay? I was also kind of nice, and it looks like when I divided by a negative, I just left the negative on the bottom. So you won't have to deal with that too much, okay? All right, any questions? Okay, so go ahead and get to work on that. I will put the colors in the back of the room so you can get to them.